Now, there are these case studies. So, we have tried to cover in each case study some critical parts. So, what does the first case study want to do? You know, there is this particular proposition of law, and I think we should make ourselves absolutely clear on this particular perspective over here, and I think Sir will agree that when we discuss on the panel, and he is also our brother professional because he is first a chartered accountant, then an IRS officer, and then a commissioner, just as we first are all CAs. Am I right, sir? Yeah. Fine. So now it's like this. Though I may ask him some questions, it is his personal view, and I think that's something which we all have to accept very graciously, that he will give his personal view, does not necessarily identify with the department view. And that's critical. Otherwise, then there is no fun. So it's like this. There is this concept. And how right this concept is, I do not know. But there is this concept in international transfer pricing that you can notionally attribute income to transactions under section 92(1). Is it correct or not is not the question on this table at the today. So therefore, just to clear doubts, the first case study tries to refer to attribution of income. Is it covered under specified domestic transactions? Is it covered under the so-called domestic transfer pricing? So that is one part of case study 1. Then the persons which are covered under section 48(2) is indirect holding covered, and we'll get to that. Then what is the effect of the amendment in 2012 or 13 to section 48(2) where something like fellow subsidiaries are covered? So that is also covered in the case study. Then most important, where does section 48(2), where is it legislated and what is the heading? So I will read 48(2) before we get to the case study. Not the whole section, only some parts. Because capital account transactions are covered, and there is a lot of queries, lot of discussion in various forums on this particular perspective. Whether interest payment is covered, very interesting. I'll try and give you a perspective which probably will be the opposite of everyone, but I'll try and give it to you, because if you don't think, then we can't think. And then how do you benchmark if you have to benchmark interest? So now for capital expenditure, and because this first case study is only on section 48(2), no? So therefore, before we open the case study, for the wisdom from my co-panelist, I will just read one or two important lines of section 48(2). Section 40A finds itself in the chapter 4, computation of business income. And what's the heading of section 40A? Expenses or payments not deductible in certain circumstances. Important for us to understand the play of capital expenditure. I am aware that headings are not to be used only for the purposes of interpretation of law, but you have to read the law as it is. That's the first principle of reading law. Headings may give you an indication, but is not necessarily the law. So if there is a tug of war between an heading or a marginal note and the law itself, then the law prevails. That's what the Supreme Court says, which under Article 141 is the law of the land, of the Constitution. So what does 40A1 say? We all refer to 40A2, but we should read 40A1 also. Important. The provisions of this section shall have effect notwithstanding anything to the contrary contained in any provision of this Act relating to the the computation of income under the head profits and gains of business or profession. And 48.2a, the last line I will read, so much of the expenditure as is so considered by him, that is the assessing officer, to be excessive or unreasonable shall not be allowed as a deduction. So therefore, the heading matches with the written law. I'll close it. Now I hand it over first to my friend Rohan. Rohan, your case study, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Vispi. Thank you, Vispi, for the detailed discussion and starting this panel discussion. Also, let me just mention that my name is Rohan Fattarfikar, and I think the second name is a tongue twister, and normally ends up getting pronounced in a different way. I think just to give a background and my perspective on this domestic TP before we get into the case study. I really don't want to go into the history because probably through the day you've understood really what was the objective of introducing the domestic transfer pricing. But, and of course it has been there in a lot of countries like US or China, and it's not a new thing that has come to India. But I think the objective of introducing domestic TP, the way the Supreme Court actually outlined and the way the law has been framed, I think it ends up really getting into various elements of compliance, which are actually unwarranted, and also technical situations which really creates a lot of conflicts. So let me give you just an example that I don't think that the real intention on this domestic TP was to look at something like remuneration paid to directors, for example. Now, and as you are aware in transfer pricing, when you're looking at comparabilities, you have to look at comparing yourself with companies which do not have related party transactions. Now, payment to directors will be there for each and every company. And to that extent, they have a related party transaction, and each company would to that extent be related. In that sense, are you in a position to compare yourself with another company which has related party transaction? So there are a lot of these technicalities, and if you really get into too much of it, then one cannot really apply the law. And I would feel that one needs to have a practical approach to this, because transfer pricing as it is not rocket science, it's very subjective, and one has to get on and not look at things on a technical basis, because otherwise you will end up not implementing the law. So just getting into this case study, and I will just read it out for everyone's benefit so that we are on the same page. So here we are talking about a company which is, okay, so I am presuming that everyone has gone through the case study? Okay. So the first question basically that comes up is, and I think for the purpose of this case study we have to assume that none of the entities are claiming tax holiday, because then I think the implications will be slightly different. So whether guarantee provided by A Limited to B Limited is covered by the provisions of specified domestic TP, if covered, whether notional income can be attributed in the hands of A Limited for non-receipt of commission fee on guarantee. Now, I would appreciate if probably you could start in a sense that we've gone through this. So anyone who can answer this question? So why not? So, if you look at really 48.2 and talks about expenditure, and very clearly 48.2b is not triggered, and hence currently no provisions in domestic TP is there for imputation of income, and hence no income can be attributed in the hands of A Limited. However, I would feel that one caution one has to look at is to need to evaluate if any expenses have been incurred by A Limited for providing the guarantee, as there could be issues on 37(1) implications. Anything that you want to say, Mr. Jain?
Yeah, good afternoon. Let me first tell you that whatever I speak, that is my personal view. This is not department's view. And second, that I am only a student of transfer pricing, and I have learned so much from Vispi Bhai and all others. And domestic transfer pricing is something which I have not yet started learning. So I'll just try to put my views across, that's all, nothing more than that. What I feel that yes, if some entity, as Rohan pointed out, that if some entity is paying incurring some expenditure on providing guarantee for the other company, that expenditure, does it become subject matter of 48(2)(b? Of course, directly to my mind, it does not. But the assessing officer or TPO may take a view that the expenditure has been incurred for the benefit of other company. Like in transfer pricing, the expenditure has been like AMP. The expenditure has been incurred for the benefit of some other entity. Similarly, here if the expenditure has been incurred for the benefit of some other entity, why not that expenditure be subject matter of disallowance, be it domestic transfer pricing or be it under some other provision. That is my first view. Second, that what do you think? I mean, I would rather invite your views on this, that can the TPO take recourse to 92F and would like to somehow cover this transaction under the domestic transfer pricing to impute notional income? The few years back, guarantee commission in India was non-existent, but now we have lot of litigation on this. Just loud thinking that TPOs, they have TPOs. I was also a TPO, and we have all the methods. I mean, at times beyond the law. So, so can a transfer pricing officer invoke 92F? Maybe 5 transaction and would like to cover somehow this transaction in domestic transfer pricing. Maybe Vispi Bhai can explain this thing better, and maybe you can have your own views.
(92F) can only define what is a transaction, but the disallowance takes place where? Under section 48(2) read with 92(2)(a), and therefore what does 48(2) talk of? Any expenditure in the nature of payment being made to a particular person as defined in 48(2)(b). So you have to read it strictly, and I would believe that you cannot even rope in the indirect expenditure under section 48(2). Whether you can rope it under 37(1) is a different perspective. But under 48(2), indirect expenditure is not covered. It is only payment made to a related person that is covered. I mean, that's the way I think you should read the law strictly, because law is to be read strictly. You don't add words to law, you don't subtract words from law. There is no equity in law. And therefore, if the burden is great, that's your bad luck. If the charge escapes, then it is your good luck. And that's what Supreme Court says. Correct, no, Ajit Bhai?
Vispi Bhai is always correct.
No. I think that's not correct. That's not correct. Okay. So I think if one were to read the law strictly, then it's not covered. Whether the transfer pricing officer can try ingenuinely to try and attribute income, I think extremely difficult under the provisions of the law. 92(1) may allow him, because it is both income and expense which is covered. In 48(2) only expense is covered.
Okay, so in that case, I need to suggest to the CBDT to change the law slightly.
Correct.
I mean, that will be in the benefit of all, that will be beneficial to all the professionals, in fact.
Okay, then there is another part. I think it's like this. Okay, probably I know if we continue like this, we will not get through the case study. So if there is time, I will give you some particular version of this particular aspect, that if CBDT were to bring it also, in which fashion they would have to bring it. They would have to amend which part of the section is going to be critical. They can't amend section 40A, they'll have to amend section 28. Am I right?
No, I think that you will tell me personally.
Okay.
But that's what happens is that you introduce the law for a particular purpose, and by the time you,
Yeah.
as the years pass, you forget the
Correct.
purpose of.
So I think-
here, if there are changes, I would feel that it would be the tail wagging the dog then.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think now let's get back to the question because I think that's critical. And I think let's do it like this, Rohan. You give your view on all the questions, then let Ajit Bhai give his views, and then we'll conclude.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So the second question and
last. Fine.
others will not be able to. Okay, the second question is whether A Limited and C Limited are specified persons as covered by section 48(2) of the Act. Now again, here there was a lot of, at least initially, especially given the fact that there is a CBDT circular of 1968, which talks about indirect coverage, but that again is a very limited coverage. Also, the initial version of the guidance note that came about talked about the coverage of indirect holding. But very clearly, to my mind, it covers what the section really covers is beneficial ownership. And to that extent, if the beneficial ownership is not there, purely holding of shares will not result in kind of a 48(2) kind of a relationship. So I would believe that in this case, since only there is a stake, indirect equity stake, the two parties would not be related. The third question is whether transaction of payment for purchase of machineries by D Limited to B Limited is covered by the provisions of specified domestic transaction. Now, again, if you look at 48(2), it talks about expenditure. And expenditure to a certain extent, as we discussed, expenditure is something that you have to spend. Capital expenditure is anyway is not deductible, and again to that extent the depreciation that results from the capital expenditure also is in various case laws considered to be not an expenditure but an allowance, and to that extent normally it ought not to get covered. But again, we are assuming here a situation where it is not a tax holiday company. If it's a tax holiday company, then again the implications would be different. Again, there could be situations where you are claiming 35(2)(ab kind of a deduction, in which case it is actually going on to reduce your profits. To that extent, it would get covered. So really depending on what situation you are in, you may have to look at and cover it under SDT. The last question on this is that whether transaction of payment of interest on loan by B Limited to D Limited is covered by the provisions of SDT. If yes, how would you benchmark the same? I would believe so, because B Limited and D Limited are related, and because there is a common shareholder, and that's something that is covered now. And for benchmarking, I would believe that you could check for internal CUPs or vis-a-vis both B and D. If not, look at external comparables like bank interest rates or publicly available information to that extent. So that's in brief my take on these 4 questions.
On most of the issues, I think I'll agree with Rohan. Regarding the second question, what is the relationship between A and C? I'm sure someday the officers are going to invoke the concept of beneficial ownership. I'm sure. And for that, one must be prepared that these transactions are going to be covered between A and C. The third question is whether the purchase and sale of machine, of course, to my understanding, it should be out of the purview of specified domestic transaction. Depreciation, of course, this will remain slightly disputed. Whether depreciation, somebody will definitely try to say that yes, depreciation is covered. But of course, this is not an expenditure, this is an allowance, and in that case, of course, this cannot be covered. The fourth question is about the interest on loan. Interest has to be benchmarked. Absolutely clear, it has to be benchmarked. And prevailing market rate, I think that is the best option available for the benchmarking. That's my view.
Thank you, friends. I think therefore there is clarity on most aspects. Now this indirect holding, and I think what Sir has tried to say is that someone will try and rope it in. So when someone tries to rope it in, that is not the law. that is the perspective of the administration. Law is only settled by the courts. So it's like this, that no way is it covered today, and under the law as it stands, even under beneficial ownership, it should not get covered. And what is the reason behind it? Beneficial ownership not defined. So how would a layman understand beneficial ownership? One, that you are the owner of that means you are the owner of that particular property, whether it be a pen, whether it be land and building, or whether it be shares, and you have the ability to exercise rights of ownership, dispose it off, earn income from that. That's the only way you can see beneficial ownership. You cannot see beneficial ownership into indirect holding, because wherever the law wants indirect holding to get covered, or indirect type of expenditure to get covered. So therefore, under section 92A(1), both direct and indirect is covered. So the law is specific. Where the law is not specific, then the law stands there. You cannot add words to the law, no? So therefore, if direct and indirect was to be covered, then it would have been legislated. So it is not legislated, so it should not get covered. Just like section 64, there is the proposition of indirect. So wherever the word indirect is to be used, then the legislature introduces those words. If they don't introduce those words, then the law stands as it is. And now we come to the last part. And I would tend to agree that yes, interest gets covered. But I'll give you a brain teaser. And I think I would like just my co-panelists to just try and give their flavor. Is all expenditure covered under section 48(2)? Or would you read the law extremely strictly? So I'll give you a version of that. It's only a version. I'm just trying to play some games with you all. Maybe sometimes something may come out of that. So it's like this. Where the assessee incurs any expenditure in respect of which payment has been made or is to be made to a person. Fine. No problem. Does the law stand still over there? And the answer is no. And what does it say? It says that this is for what purpose? Excessive or unreasonable, having regard to the fair market value. Now you read, of the goods, services or facilities. Is interest covered? Not covered. If they want to cover, read section 92(1) explanation. We will read. This is only a version, huh? I know sir is already thinking that what type of tank I should get now. So it's like this. For the removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that the allowance for any expense or interest, 92(2)(a), any allowance for an expenditure or interest or allocation. 48(2) says expenditure to compute the fair market value of the goods, services or facilities. Is loan a facility? Yes. Is interest therefore a cost of that facility? Answer is yes. But is it strictly covered? I do not know. They have better knowledge. So therefore I have to say it gets covered. Anyone wants to take this question on the panel?
No, it is definitely a facility. It's a financing facility.
Fine. Correct. So therefore, does the law say that all facilities are facilities and therefore there is no such thing as a financial transaction? Then why is it that wherever there has to be an allowance, disallowance, withholding of tax on interest, there is a specific section? I don't know. Is that the law? And I would believe that as it stands today, interest does get covered. Is there a possibility of a further discussion on that? I believe yes. Rohan?
I think I have already given my views. Sir.
Okay, fine. I think enough of a discussion. We go to the next case study.
So, in the case study 2, we are talking about Innovative Technologies Private Limited, which is a company registered in India and which has a subsidiary in the UK, Technocrat UK, and it holds 25%. Now, of course, the whole point here is that the shareholding of 25% is been put because of various issues. The question here is that whether when India is transacting with UK, which is a cross-border transaction, whether TUK should be governed by the transfer pricing provisions. Now, ideally, if you look at what is there in the cross-border or international transfer pricing, is a shareholding of 26%, whereas here we are talking about a situation where the shareholding is 25%, which is obviously less. To my mind, yes, if one has to look at the provisions of domestic transfer pricing where the trigger is 20% or more, I would believe that the transaction between the two companies would get covered, although the stake is less than 26%, because 48(2)(b) does not refer to any residency, and to that extent, so it's not really a coverage that although it's to domestic transfer pricing, it does not really restrict it to India. And just to give a corollary of that, when we talked about international transfer pricing, there was also, say, a situation where a non-resident bank in India, a bank branch basically, which would be a non-resident, if it dealt with a resident in India, although it was a transaction within India, it was still getting covered under international transfer pricing as well. So to that extent, under international transfer pricing also local transactions were getting covered, because the trigger was a non-resident dealing with a resident or vice versa. The second question is on how would ITP benchmark the remuneration and sitting fees paid to Sweety and Salty. Now, of course, the entire aspect about benchmarking of remuneration is a big thing, and again there is no one definite answer to that. There are, just to make a reference, there are restrictions under company law which could be useful, but again you have situations where earlier you had the rates for royalty, which was coming under the automatic approval, which the officers and which the companies referred to because it was falling under the Reserve Bank of India approval. It was said that that approval has got nothing to do with the transfer pricing provision. So it's a challenge. I would feel that one has to look at various aspects. I would assume that the sixth method, which has come into play now, which is the other method, which would be quite relevant if one has to look at the benchmarking of remuneration, because it gives you an opportunity to look at qualitative and quantitative aspect. So it could go into various things. I mean, I cannot really pinpoint how exactly it can be done. It has to, but some of the things that could be looked at would be the methodology adopted while fixing the remuneration, cost-benefit analysis, the experience. Since these two people are from reputed institutions, you would have some kind of benchmarks that would be available. Also, I wanted to just refer to one publication, which is basically guidance given by ICSI, which is a recommendation to strengthen corporate governance framework, which is an old version, but it talks about what really goes about in remuneration, and you can maintain documentations which would actually show remuneration policy of the company, appraisal mechanism, a lot of these aspects. So maybe this is some kind of reference, but again there is no particular way. I would feel that a transactional net margin method could only be a supporting method rather than the first method for that.
Okay. Now, let's be very clear about the facts that the Indian company has 25% shareholding of the foreign company. It's a foreign company. And Rohan has pointed out that for the purposes of 48(2)(b, the residency is not important, and Rohan has also referred to bank branches situation. To my understanding, all these bank branches, they are covered under permanent establishments. And for PE, I am sure that they can be covered. Now the issue here is whether 20% or 26%, what should be taken as the threshold for deciding that whether 48(2)(b will apply or the international transfer pricing will apply. I think 48(2)(b is a general rule and 92 is a specific rule. So which rule will prevail? I think that's very, very clear that a specific rule should prevail. and if a specific rule prevails, then it is 25%. It is less than the threshold of 26%. Of course, 48(2)(b, somehow it can be covered. Yes, of course, I think it can be covered because it is more than 20%. But international transfer pricing should not apply in this situation, to my understanding. Second question is about the remuneration, which is very, very simple issue, but the most difficult issue. As I say that CUP is the easiest method, but most difficult to apply. Same is the situation in remuneration, that remuneration is such a simple transaction, but where from you will find good comparables. Comparables which are unrelated party, uncontrolled transactions, and similar kind of comparables, which is very, very difficult. And the best thing that Rohan has suggested is TNMM. I think for remuneration, it's very, very good, because then just for the sake of remuneration, we cover all the transaction of the entity. It's good leverage to the tax department. Visby bhai.
Technically 48(2) covers it. So I'll give you a brain teaser. 92(BA) says, for the purposes of this section and section 92, 92C, 92D and 92E, specified domestic transaction in case of an SSE means any of the following transactions not being an international transaction. So what do you mean by not being an international transaction? Is it international transaction as defined under section 92B, or is it the characteristics of the transaction under section 92B? That means it is cross-border, not between two associated entities. I am aware of that. So can you therefore say, now this is something extremely stringent, you can't say it, but I am just trying to give you some food for thought, because we all have to start thinking, friends. It's like this, that if a transaction escapes a particular mischief of the law under section 92, which is more specific, can the law then rope in that transaction under a general mischief? So that's the tussle between a specific section, a general section, specific mischief, general mischief. What will prevail in law? That the Lord alone knows. The courts will tell us. On the face of it, it gets covered under section 48(2). And I think for remuneration, all the reasons have been stated by my co-panelists, but I think there is one very good other reason which I believe should also help in the benchmarking, is that there is no arbitrage of tax. One is a loss-making company, so there is no question of shifting profit the other way around. That means if I would have not taken any remuneration, then actually I would have probably been in profit, and to that extent I would have set off my carried forward losses, because the losses are there since many years. So therefore, one of the things that we have to see in domestic transfer pricing is, and that is also referred to by GlaxoSmithKline, it is referred to that old circular which Rohan said, that if there is no arbitrage of tax, so what is the arbitrage? 33% versus 35% or something? That's corporate tax. So there is not much of arbitrage. It is not that there is tax holiday and there is no tax, and there is tax payable on the other side. So where there is no tax arbitrage also, where there is tax neutrality, then I would believe that the transaction is inherently at arm's length. Just any views on that particular perspective from my co-panelists? Welcome.
I wish that there was a precondition of tax neutrality or tax avoidance motive in the domestic transfer pricing. That would have been better.
But actually that was the objective. If you look at the Supreme Court decision, it actually outlined certain circumstances which was eroding the tax base, and that was what the focus was. But
yes, Glaxo, the things are very, very clear.